I know this is going to sound strange, but the worst day of my life wasn't when my own son locked me and my husband in the basement. The worst day was when I realized that, deep down, it was our own family that pushed him to that point, full of silence, secrets, and fear, dressed up as, "We're fine." When the door slammed upstairs and I heard the key turning slowly, I didn't just hear metal. I heard every, "we'll talk about it later," that never happened, every question he asked with his eyes that we pretended not to see. And if you're here with me right now, listening to this story, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and hit like, because I need to tell you everything without cutting corners. Not just to entertain you, but so maybe you'll look differently at your own home, your own family. The scene was like this. Darkness, damp air, that feeling of being in a place where people only keep what they don't want to look at. And in the middle of that silence, my husband came closer to me and whispered, "Quiet, I have a secret." In that moment, I realized the key Ethan had in his hand wasn't the only one that mattered. There were other keys, invisible ones. We'd been turning for years. Keys from hidden appointments, reports kept in the basement, conversations cut in half. What scared me the most wasn't being trapped down there. It was realizing that, emotionally, our family had been living locked up for a long time already, each one of us in our own inner basement, full of secrets and fear. Maybe, from the outside, you'd think, "That's awful. What an ungrateful son. What a cruel kid." I thought that too, in the first few minutes, to be honest. But the truth, and it hurts, is that no one turns into a villain out of nowhere. No teenager just wakes up one day and decides from scratch, "Today I'm going to lock my parents in the basement." There is always a before. Tiny warning signs, throwaway lines, weird drawings, mood swings we blame on a phase. Our house used to get compliments. People would say, "What a beautiful family, what a polite son, what a solid marriage." But behind that picture-frame smile, there was a script full of fear and silence that we never had the courage to rewrite. And I don't want you to listen to this story like it's just some distant movie. I want you to ask yourself, while you hear me, do I have something like this in my house too? Am I also pushing things under the rug, pretending it's just stress, just being tired, just a phase? By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? I like to imagine this conversation reaching different living rooms, in families that look normal on the outside, but inside carry the same trio that almost destroyed mine: secret, fear, and shame of asking for help. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit like because with every story I tell here, I hope at least one person finds the courage to open a door before someone does it out of pure desperation. Deep down, this isn't just the story of a son who locks his parents up. It's the story of two adults who swore they'd protect their boy, but confused protection with control, love with silence, care with hiding the truth. My husband had a heavy past, a secret that started long before I existed. I had my own fears, my own hidden appointments, my own decisions made without telling the whole truth. And Ethan grew up breathing all of that without understanding, without words for it, without being part of the conversation, until the day he decided to do to us exactly what he'd felt his whole life that we did to him: lock, shut down, decide over his head. What I'm going to tell you through this story is not pretty, not polished, and definitely not designed to make our family look good. I'm going to show you how good intentions can turn into weapons, how untreated fear becomes the loudest voice in the house, how lack of real conversation turns your kid into a stranger, and parents into extras in their own story. But I'm also going to show you the other side, what happens when the door finally opens. Not just the basement door, but the door to hard conversations, to therapy, to vulnerability. Because as painful as it is to admit, sometimes you need to hit the bottom of the basement to realize the only way to save a family is to stop running from the truth. And if you stay with me until the end, I can promise you one thing: you won't walk away the same. Not because I have perfect answers, but because some stories work like a mirror, and mirrors, like when they're honest, make us uncomfortable. Maybe you'll remember someone you love who's been different lately, quieter, more explosive, more distant. Maybe you'll remember a secret you swore you'd never tell. Maybe you'll realize your biggest fear isn't losing people, it's facing what exists between you. So stay with me, subscribe, hit like, and if something hurts along the way, remember this: pain that you look in the eye can become a turning point. What almost destroyed my family was silence. What started to save us was, ironically, finally learning how to speak. That day, I swear, everything felt absolutely normal, almost boring for a regular family life. The smell of coffee was still in the air, the morning light cutting crooked through the kitchen window, and the sound of Ethan's footsteps upstairs seemed like just another tiny detail in our routine. I had no idea that, in a few minutes, the simplest sound in the world, the click of a lock, would completely redefine what I understood as home, safety, and love. When I heard the basement door slam, I didn't pay much attention. I just assumed Michael had gone down to grab something from the old boxes. It was only when I heard the key turn, slowly, almost theatrically, that a cold fear crawled up my spine. That wasn't a random noise. It was a gesture, a decision. And the scariest part wasn't the locked door. It was knowing who was on the other side holding the key. Our son, our Ethan, our piece of family, holding a secret. I couldn't even put into words yet. I ran to the basement stairs, pounding my palm against the door, calling his name, first calmly, then a bit louder, and then with no mask of serenity left at all. You know that moment when your brain tries to justify the unjustifiable. Maybe he's just playing. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe the lock jammed by itself. The mind is a pro at making up excuses so we don't have to stare. Fear in the face. Michael came up behind me, quiet in that heavy way of someone who already understood something I was still trying to deny. With every second that passed, the basement seemed to shrink, like the walls were closing in, squeezing not just our bodies, but our whole family story together with us. Even without answers yet, I already knew there was a huge secret between the three of us, and it had just manifested itself in the shape of a locked door. Funny how, in moments like that, even the way you breathe changes. The air felt thicker, slower, like I had to fight it just to fill my lungs. Michael tried talking to Ethan through the door, using that calm dad voice that's trying not to make things worse, but I could hear the little tremor underneath. Fear always finds a way out, even when we try to hide it. And it's strange to think that in a simple basement, where we used to just store boxes, old Christmas decorations, and dusty memories, we were now storing something much heavier, a secret hiding behind our own son's silence. At that point, maybe you're wondering how you would react if someone in your family, someone you love, locked you up with no explanation. And since we're here together, let me ask you, from what city are you watching this video? I like to imagine this story echoing in different homes, in different families, because deep down, everyone carries a little bit of that fear of being betrayed by the people they trust the most. When you watch movies or shows about broken families, everything looks distant, exaggerated, almost made up. But when it's you standing there with your forehead pressed against a cold wooden door, calling your own son's name and getting nothing but loaded silence in return, it feels like you're stuck inside a lucid nightmare. I'd look at Michael, he'd look at me, and without saying a word, we were asking the same question. Where did we go wrong? That's the kind of fear that has no face, no shape, but weighs more than anything physical. And that's when you realize the idea of family is never as simple as the smiling photos in the frames. Down there, locked in, I had no idea that quiet, "I have a secret," what Michael was about to whisper, was just the first thread of a ball of yarn that had started rolling long before that day. Oh, and let me quickly ask you something without breaking the mood. If this story has already started to stir something in you, subscribe to the channel and hit like, because it really helps us keep bringing intense stories like this, where fear, secret, and everything that makes a family so complicated get tangled together. Back in the basement, I leaned my back against the damp wall and tried to organize my thoughts. In theory, I knew parents and kids clash sometimes, that teenagers can be impulsive, that a young mind is like a minefield. But it's one thing to know that as a concept. It's another to be literally locked up because of a decision your own son made. I started replaying the last weeks, months, maybe years in my head, searching for signs, hints, cracks that could explain such an extreme gesture. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt this secret hadn't been born that day. Michael, in his own way, had always tried to be the pillar of our family, the one who stays calm, cracks jokes, keeps things light. But in that moment, in the middle of all that fear, I saw something different in his eyes. It wasn't just panic, it was recognition. Like Ethan's act had triggered old memories. Shadows he preferred to keep locked in some inner basement I'd never been allowed to see. He moved closer, lowered his voice and whispered, "Sarah, stay calm, quiet, I have a secret." And it wasn't just what he said that gave me chills. It was how he said it. As if this secret wasn't just an explanation, but a piece of our history that had been hidden from me, from Ethan, and especially from that version of family we claimed we'd built together. In that instant, I realized the basement door wasn't the only thing locked in that house. And this is where things really start to step out of just a scare and into the dangerous territory of nothing is what it seems. Because when your husband, locked in the same basement as you, looks you in the eye, and says he has a secret. At the exact moment your son locks you in, you know you're in the middle of a game that started way before you even noticed there was a board. The fear I felt was no longer just about Ethan on the other side of the door, but also about what I was about to discover right in front of me. And at the same time, strange as it sounds, a part of me desperately wanted to hear everything. Because if there's one thing that slowly kills a family from the inside, it's what never gets said. What I still didn't know was that Michael's secret was directly connected to how Ethan saw us, what he felt, and the real reason he turned that key that day. That's topic 1 fully translated into American English, keeping the tone and the keywords secret, fear, family. If you want, I can keep going straight to topic 2 and onward in order, translating everything. I'll continue from here in the next chunk, starting with, when silence finally settled in the basement, it wasn't an empty silence. It was that heavy kind, almost alive, that seems to watch every move. Sarah still had her hand pressed against the door, as if touch alone could cross wood, lock, and the emotional distance between her and her own son. That's when Michael came up behind her, slowly, like he was afraid of scaring her even more, and whispered right in her ear, "Quiet, I have a secret." The way he said secret, even in English, didn't sound like a dramatic movie line. It sounded like a late confession. In that instant, the fear Sarah felt changed shape. It wasn't just the terror of being locked up by someone in her own family anymore. It was the fear of what was about to be revealed down there, in a place where everything echoed louder, including the truth. And before I go deeper into that, let me slip in something quickly. If this story is already pulling you in, hit subscribe and like the video, because there's still a lot of this family secret to be dug up. Sarah slowly turned around, staring at Michael's face, searching for any clue that could help her understand what he meant by that. It wasn't the first time she'd felt something was off about her husband's past. Little gaps, half-told stories, memories he avoided revisiting. But now, with their son upstairs and the door locked, all of that suddenly carried a different weight. What kind of secret could you possibly have that would make our own son feel the need to lock his family in the basement? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady and failing halfway through the sentence. Michael swallowed hard, and for a moment the fear in his eyes seemed just as big as hers. It wasn't only fear of Ethan, it was fear of his past, of judgment, of what was about to come out of his own mouth. And you, listening to all this, have you ever thought how many things get shoved under the emotional rug in your own family? Michael asked her to sit on the wooden step, a little farther from the door, as if he were afraid Ethan might be there, right on the other side, listening to every word. The fear of being overheard by his own son mixed with the fear of finally speaking. He took a deep breath, ran a hand through his hair, and started with something Sarah had never heard from him before. Nothing that's happening here started with Ethan, Sarah. It started with me, long before we ever became a family. And it's strange, because when someone you love says that, it's like the ground shifts. Everything you believed about your home, your marriage, your son suddenly feels like it was built on quicksand. Down there, in that basement, Sarah felt like she wasn't just physically locked in, she was about to be locked inside a story, a secret, she never chose to carry. And since we're having this kind of intimate conversation, if you haven't yet, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? I like imagining this family's story sitting next to yours, wherever you are. He started talking about his own childhood, but still in fragments, like someone opening a door to the past, just a crack, afraid everything will collapse at once. He said fear had always been part of his life, from as far back as he could remember. The house he grew up in also had doors that locked, but back then, it wasn't because of a son, it was because of adults. He used the word family, like it was both shelter and threat, like he'd already felt on his own skin the dark side of people who are supposed to protect you. Sarah listened with a lump forming in her throat. She began to mentally connect Ethan's behavior, the distant looks, the outbursts out of nowhere, the way he sometimes seemed to carry an invisible weight. "Do you think our son inherited that fear, those shadows?" she asked. Michael lowered his gaze, took his time, and answered, "He inherited more than that, Sarah. He inherited a secret that never should have existed." By this point, the basement wasn't just a setting anymore. It had turned into a kind of intimate courtroom, where past and present were being judged at the same time. Sarah felt a mix of anger and compassion, anger at being kept in the dark for so long, compassion at realizing her husband had been carrying a corrosive fear by himself for years. She started remembering times when Michael had been overprotective with Ethan, oddly strict about some things and strangely permissive with others. Things that, in the rush of family life, she had chalked up to, that's just his personality. But now, with this talk of an old secret, Nothing seemed that innocent. And if this story is holding your attention, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications, because that tells me these kinds of deep narratives, the ones that poke at real emotions, are worth continuing. Michael then leaned in a little closer, like he was about to cross an internal line he'd avoided his whole life. He explained that, before Ethan was even born, before they even seriously thought about becoming a family, he had started making decisions based on pure fear. Fear of repeating his own story, fear of watching his child go through what he went through, fear of not being strong enough to protect the people he loved. And from that fear, the so-called secret was born. He talked about doctors, specialists, things they did for the good of their future child, but still without explaining every detail. Sarah's head was spinning. What did he mean by, for the good of our future child? What kind of choice made before birth could echo so loudly that it turned a teenager into the boy who locked his parents in a basement? It felt like, with every sentence, another layer of fantasy about their perfect family was being ripped off. The most disturbing part was that, even without understanding everything yet, Sarah felt like this secret had a direct line to that locked door. It was as if Ethan's extreme act wasn't just rebellion, but a reaction to something he might have discovered or sensed, even without having all the words. Michael let slip that there were things about Ethan's mental health he knew and had never told her. Things about tests, conversations with professionals, early signs he'd tried to manage on his own, wanting to be the hero of the family, but actually feeding a silent monster. The fear that everyone would find out the truth. Sarah didn't say anything for a few seconds. She just breathed deeply, trying to align the avalanche of information. She still didn't know it, but this was only the beginning. Because what came next wasn't just about a father and a son. It was about how an entire, apparently perfect family had been crumbling on the inside for years, without anyone on the outside suspecting a thing. To anyone on the outside, the Johnsons' house looked like a picture from a commercial. Freshly cut lawn, neat front porch, warm lights at dinner time, laughter drifting into the hallway on Sundays. At Christmas, there was a wreath on the door, carefully wrapped gifts under the tree, a smiling family photo posted online with a caption about gratitude and love, the kind of image that makes people think, wow, they're so lucky. And that's exactly where the danger hides. The more perfect the frame, the easier it is to hide what's cracked underneath. Michael and Sarah were experts at building that image. They were great at masking fear with smiles, secret with small talk, and pain with light jokes. And if you're still here listening to all this, go ahead and subscribe and like the video, because we need to keep talking about what really happens behind a perfect family image. At school, Ethan was the nice kid, polite, intelligent, quiet in just the right way. Teachers praised his grades. Classmates said he was chill. Other parents complimented Michael and Sarah. Your son is so mature. You did a great job. Sarah would smile and say thank you. But deep down, she had this little feeling she couldn't name. Just a tiny point of fear. That subtle sense that something wasn't quite right. Like there was a delay between what the world saw and what really happened inside their house. Michael, on the other hand, clung to those compliments like a lifeline. If the world said everything was okay, then maybe the big secret he was hiding wasn't doing so much damage. You ever notice how often we use other people's opinions as a crutch so we don't have to face what we already know deep down? In the daily routine, the family life looked normal enough if you glanced quickly. Dinner together a few times a week, light arguments over who would do the dishes, playful teasing about shows and movies, gifts on special dates. But if someone paid closer attention, they'd see the small details that gave the cracks away. The way Ethan avoided eye contact in certain conversations, the way Sarah changed the subject when he asked deeper questions, the way Michael's gaze drifted off for a second like his mind had gone somewhere else he didn't want to explain. These were little signals that the secret was already sitting at the table with them, right next to the water pitcher and the salt shaker, even though nobody ever said its name out loud. And let me ask you, in your house, how is it? From what city are you watching this? Are there subjects that sit at the table with your family, but nobody dares to name? Over time, the house itself started to reflect this split. The living room was always neat and cozy, full of photos from trips, graduations, birthdays, but if you opened the right drawers, you'd find unsent letters, old medical exams, prescriptions, rushed notes scribbled on scraps of paper, things Sarah told herself she'd sort through later, things Michael promised to organize someday, things Ethan might have come across in silence, letting fear grow inside him without any explanation. That's how a secret grows. Not all at once, but in daily doses of silence. And if this story is making you look differently at the idea of a perfect family, hit subscribe, because the whole point here is to take the mask off and talk about what's happening backstage. From the outside, Ethan looked like the child every parent thinks they want. Not getting into trouble, not out partying, not talking back to teachers, but that calm came with an invisible cost. He was learning, from an early age, that in this family you don't talk about everything, that some topics sucked the air out of the room, that certain questions made his dad tense and his mom uncomfortable. And when a kid realizes that, they don't think, my parents have a secret. They think, something's wrong with me for wanting to ask. That's the kind of thought that plants seeds of deep fear. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of breaking the perfect picture. Fear of being the one who ruins what everyone praises. Ironically, in trying to protect him from the truth, his parents were building a mental maze inside his head. As the years went by, the photos kept being taken, birthdays kept being celebrated, and the holiday dinners looked just as warm as ever. But Ethan's eyes weren't the same. Sometimes, even surrounded by his family, he looked like he was far away, present only in body while his mind wandered through questions no one there wanted to answer. Sarah tried to talk about the future, college, career, plans, as if a well-designed roadmap could cover up any emotional pothole. Michael, still haunted by fear, dodged any talk that might tug at the thread of his secret. He liked to believe that time alone would fix everything, but time doesn't erase secrets. It ferments them. And that's how this seemingly perfect family started to quietly fall apart from the inside, right up until the day a simple turn of a key in the basement made it obvious that the real collapse had started long before. Long before the day Ethan locked his parents in the basement. The truth is, that house had already been signaling that something was off. At first, it was small stuff, easy to ignore when family life was busy and rushed. He, who had always been a curious boy, started getting quieter, answering in short sentences, shutting himself in his room for hours without saying why. Sarah said it was a phase, and Michael agreed, mostly because it was easier to believe that than to face the fear that something deeper might be going on. Over time, those tiny oddities stacked up. The distant look at dinner, sudden irritation for no clear reason, nights when they heard his footsteps pacing upstairs. And hey, if this story has already grabbed you somehow, go ahead and subscribe and hit like A, because there's still a lot of secret and fear and family to unpack. One of the first signs that really bothered Sarah was when she started finding Ethan's drawings. He'd always loved to draw, ever since he was little. But before, it was superheroes, game worlds, little landscapes. Suddenly, the pages changed. Locked doors, windows with no glass, houses split down the middle, silhouettes of people with no faces. On the edges, he scribbled words that looked random but formed a strange pattern. Fear, guilt, alone. Every time she saw those drawings, she felt a tightness in her chest, but instead of really talking to him, she'd slip the pages into a folder, as if hiding the drawings could hide the reality. Michael, when he saw them, brushed it off as teenager stuff, saying he'd been a weird teenager too. What he didn't realize was that the secret he carried was the lens making him minimize everything. Like if he admitted it was serious, he'd have to admit his own past was echoing through the family again. Another thing that started standing out was how Ethan reacted to certain topics. Whenever someone mentioned mental health, therapy, medication, or stories about people who weren't okay in the head, he'd get visibly uncomfortable. Sometimes he'd leave the table, change the subject, or make harsh jokes that felt more like armor than humor. Sarah felt that wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was defense. Michael, listening, would stiffen in a way she didn't fully understand. He recognized in his son something he himself had learned years ago. Never show weakness, never admit fear, never talk about what hurts. And caught between the two, the family did what many do. They kept pushing off a conversation that could have changed everything. By the way, let me ask you, what city are you watching this from? Sometimes a story like this makes us finally look at signs we've been ignoring at home. Around that time, the sudden outbursts started. Tiny things turned into arguments. A simple reminder to clean his room, a conversation about grades, even a casual good morning on the wrong day became trigger points. Ethan didn't slam doors. He knew that would attract too much attention, but his eyes changed. They got hard, distant, like he was holding back something much bigger. Sarah, deep down, felt fear. Not fear of her son, but fear of losing him emotionally, of not knowing how to reach whatever was going on inside him. Michael's instinct was to respond with firmness, more rules, stricter limits, threats of taking away his games, like discipline alone could fix a crack that was clearly emotional. If you're hearing this and recognize any of these patterns in someone in your family, Maybe this is the nudge to look with less judgment and more curiosity. At night, the house started to feel different. The silence that used to be peaceful turned heavy. Sarah heard Ethan walking around after midnight, opening and closing cabinet doors slowly, the bathroom faucet turning on and off. Some mornings she'd find the living room light on, and a half-full glass of water on the table, as if someone had come downstairs, wandered around, tried to find some peace, and gone back to bed defeated. One night, she went down and found him sitting on the couch, staring at the TV while it was turned off. When she asked if he was okay, he said, "Yeah, Mom, I just can't stop thinking." The worst part wasn't the words. It was how he said them, like his own mind was a basement he was trapped in. Michael, who knew more than he'd ever told Sarah, felt his fear spike, but still kept pushing off real decisions, convincing himself that keeping the secret was better than destabilizing the family. Then came the moment that, looking back, Sarah now sees as a giant flashing warning sign. Ethan came home early from school one day, looking pale, eyes red, but not like someone who'd been crying, more like someone exhausted from holding something in. When she insisted on knowing what happened, he just said, "Nothing, Mom. I just realized some things were never meant for us to know." At the time, it sounded too philosophical for his age, so she laughed nervously, hugged him, offered a snack, and changed the subject. Later, when she told Michael, he froze for a second, like the boy had accidentally hit the center of that old secret. As adults, they did what a lot of people do in a family. They decided it was just teenage drama, because that was easier than admitting he might have stumbled onto a truth he should never have faced alone. All of this piled up, layer by layer, until the day in the basement. Ethan's behavior didn't explode out of nowhere. It was built on years of silence, glances, unasked questions, and unfinished conversations. Those first strange signs were, in reality, his first attempts to communicate that something was wrong, even if he didn't know how to say it. And underneath his distant, irritable, sometimes even scary demeanor, there was just a boy carrying not only his own fears, but the echo of choices made long before he was born. What Sarah still didn't know, and what Michael was finally starting to reveal, was that many of those signs were directly tied to his past, to decisions he'd made in secret, thinking he was protecting the family, but actually feeding the very fear that would one day swallow them all. Because the next step in this story is exactly that, understanding what, after all, is Michael's secret, the past he never told. Down in that basement, with the air getting heavier by the minute, Michael finally understood he couldn't hold anything back anymore. The fear of losing control of the situation had already gone too far, and now his fear of losing his family was bigger than the shame of exposing his past. He pressed his back against the cold wall and drew in a breath that felt like it came from a younger version of himself. "Sarah," he said, "nothing that's happening with Ethan started today. It began years ago, when I was just a kid trying to survive in my own house. And if this story hits you, subscribe and like. This is where we connect old stories, secrets, fear, and what they do to a family." Michael's childhood looked nothing like the one he tried to give Ethan. While his son grew up in a house with food on the table, a mostly stable routine, and some version of emotional safety, Michael grew up in a place where fear was normal. His father was the kind of man whose presence alone could change the air in the room. You know that tense silence that falls when someone dangerous walks in? That was his daily soundtrack. His mother, worn out and stuck, lived in a fragile balance between protecting her son and not provoking her husband. Michael learned early that feelings were a liability. If you cried, you were weak. If you complained, you were dramatic. If you asked for help, you were a problem. So he did what many kids do to survive. He became the strong one. Good grades, no complaints, quiet. On the outside, he looked solid. On the inside, fear was rotting him slowly. In his teenage years, things got worse. His body grew, but his fears grew faster. He started having episodes no one knew how to label. Sleepless nights, racing thoughts, a constant sense that something terrible was about to happen. His heart would pound out of nowhere. His hands would sweat, and everyday things like leaving the house or sitting in a crowded room felt like walking into danger. When he tried to talk to his father, he heard, "You just need to toughen up. Stop being soft." When he went to his mother, she'd beg him not to make your father upset with this. So the fear kept growing, nameless and untreated. Things only changed when the school stepped in after noticing something was off. He was taken to a doctor, not out of love, but out of pressure. There, for the first time, someone looked at him and didn't see trouble, but a person in pain. The doctor talked about anxiety, about patterns, about possible family history. And then came the sentence that locked itself inside him. This is something that could show up again in your children one day. That phrase planted the seed of his biggest secret. The doctor mentioned family history, predisposition, genetics, trauma, talked about meds, follow-ups, but also said something that echoed for years. When you have kids, it's important to be open about this and know what to do if signs appear. Michael left that office with two very strong feelings: relief that someone had finally named his fear, and terror at the idea of ever watching a future child go through the same thing. Right there, he made a silent promise. If he ever had a family, he'd do absolutely anything to shield his child from that pain. That's a noble desire, but the way he turned it into action became the root of the problem. Instead of seeing it as a call to heal, he treated it like a mission to control. When he met Sarah and they started talking about kids, that old fear came roaring back. But instead of opening up and saying, "Look, this is my story, I'm scared, let's deal with this together," he chose secrecy. He went to doctors on his own, asked about genetics, ran tests, researched conditions that might run in his family. Some professionals were ethical, others were more pragmatic. In the middle of all that, he heard things like, there are ways to minimize risk. You can monitor closely. If early signs show up, you can intervene fast. And instead of using that information to build trust with Sarah, he used it to build his private strategic plan. He printed reports, stored test results, saved articles, and where did all that end up? In that same metal box in the basement. The one that, years later, Ethan would open. That box wasn't just a container of paper. It was where Michael stored his fear and his secret, away from the rest of the family. When Ethan was born, Michael saw two things at once: the chance to rewrite his story and the risk of reliving it. Every intense cry, every moment of silence, every odd behavior set off alarms in his head. Quietly, he booked appointments, took Ethan for evaluations disguised as routine checkups, talked to specialists without telling Sarah the full story. In Michael's head, this was him being a good father, being prepared, observant, responsible. In reality, he was making huge decisions about his son and shutting his wife out of them. That's the twisted part of some secrets. The person holding them doesn't think of themselves as lying. They think they're protecting. He told himself, "I'm strong enough to carry this alone." But nobody is. As Ethan grew, different doctors and specialists gave different opinions. Some pointed out traits, patterns, possible risk factors, but nothing final. The general recommendation was pretty clear: open dialogue, joint support, the whole family on the same page. But Michael's pattern spoke louder. He chose what to share and what to hide. He decided which reports Sarah could see and which would stay in the box. He convinced himself that if he just managed everything alone, he could keep the worst from ever happening. The result was a family living on top of a minefield no one knew existed, except him. When Ethan started showing those strange behaviors, dark drawings, isolation, cryptic phrases, Michael didn't see it as a beginning, but as confirmation of his old fear. Instead of bringing everyone together and saying, "Okay, we need to face this," he tightened the lid on the box even more. Now, locked in the basement with Sarah, he was finally putting all those pieces into words. He admitted that part of what Ethan was going through might be connected to choices he made in secret. Tests, early interventions considered, medical opinions he took as gospel without involving anyone else. Sarah listened in shock, but beneath the shock, some things started to make sense. The weird tension in Michael whenever the topic of mental health came up, his overreactions to Ethan's smallest shifts, that distant look in his eyes. The man she'd seen as the rock of the family was, in truth, someone who'd been shaking on the inside for years, holding up an entire building of appearances on the back of his untreated fear. The worst part? Michael confessed that not everything in that basement box was about his past. There was something else, something right there with them, directly tied to that secret, something physical, concrete, that had been hidden for years, waiting for the day someone would eventually find it. And that something was exactly the object hidden in the basement that Ethan should never have touched, but did. When Michael said there was something in that basement tied to his big secret, Sarah felt her stomach twist. Up until then, the basement had just been a storage space in her mind, a place for old family stuff, boxes of photos, Christmas decorations, Ethan's old toys, stacks of books. But the way Michael kept staring at the darkest corner, behind that metal shelf, told her it was more than clutter. It was like that corner had a different weight, a different energy, a spot where fear felt thicker. He nodded toward it, too scared to actually move yet, and said that something was hidden there that never should have been so close to their son. Oh, and if this story has you hooked, subscribe to the channel and hit like, because we're going deeper into how family, fear, and secret can quietly blow up a life. Sarah got up slowly, feeling the cold floor under her feet, like every step was some kind of mix between past and present. She pushed some boxes aside, dragged an old sleeping bag, pulled a ripped suitcase out of the way until she saw something that didn't belong with the rest. A metal box, different from the old cardboard ones, with less dust on it, which meant someone had opened it recently. The padlock hanging from it was broken, tilted to the side. That alone was enough to set off an alarm in her mind. Someone had been there. Someone had opened that thing. And in that moment, Ethan's quiet trips down the stairs at night made a lot more sense. Michael's secret wasn't fully locked anymore. Their son had probably seen things no teenager should see alone. The family mystery wasn't contained. It had already leaked. When Sarah lifted the lid, the smell of old paper and hospital alcohol came out, like the air itself had a memory. Inside, there were medical reports with Michael's name, scans, diagnoses, recommendations for psychiatric follow-up, crisis history, lists of medication. Mixed in with those, there were also documents with Ethan's name, behavioral evaluations, notes from specialists, exam results she had never seen. There was even a flash drive with a handwritten label, like someone had tried to organize chaos. That box wasn't just paper, it was the archive of that family's fear. Years of silent panic stored in one place. Sarah felt a quiet anger rising, not just because she'd been left out, but because she imagined what it would do to Ethan if those papers fell into his hands without context, without love, without anyone to walk him through it. It's like handing a horror book to a child and saying, "Figure it out by yourself." Michael, watching the way she stared at each document, began to explain, trying to put logic onto what looked unforgivable. He said that when the suspicion came up that Ethan might have inherited some of his patterns, he decided to gather everything: old reports, childhood diagnoses, doctor letters, printouts from articles he found about trauma, genetics, and family patterns. His plan was to have everything ready, in one place, in case they ever needed to act fast. But in reality, he had built a shrine to fear right in the heart of their home. The basement, which should have been just a place for old family memories, had become the vault for a secret too heavy for one person, and definitely too heavy for a kid. And if you've stayed with me this far, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because stories like this aren't just drama, they're mirrors for things a lot of families never dare to say out loud. The most disturbing detail, though, wasn't in the reports. Sarah found between the papers a sheet with handwriting she knew very well, Ethan's. In the corner, he'd written scattered phrases, like he was trying to process what he'd read. "Is my dad sick? Is this mine too? They don't trust me. They knew and never told me." Those sentences were like silent knives. The problem wasn't just the content of the box. It was realizing their son had probably discovered all of it alone, right there in that same basement, facing the story of his family in cold, technical language, without a hug, without explanation, without anyone to translate it into love. Imagine being a teenager and reading, in sterile medical language, that you might be at risk of disorders, episodes, instability. It's the perfect fuel for fear to grow wild. That metal box, in the end, was more than the object hidden in the basement. It was the perfect symbol of how this family dealt with everything that hurt. They shoved it in a dark corner, locked it, pretended it didn't exist, and hoped time would fix it. But time isn't a quiet cleaner. It's just a guard. If you don't touch it, it doesn't move. So the secret stayed there, getting heavier, growing, until curiosity, or desperation, made someone open it. That someone was Ethan. Instead of hearing from his parents the truth about his dad's past, about their fears, and about his own possibilities, he got a metal box full of clinical terms and zero emotional support. And for a boy already struggling, that was like being handed proof that he was a problem, not a person. It's not hard to see how that could lead to the extreme act of turning a key and locking his family in the same basement where he'd been emotionally locked all along. Now, with the box open and the secret finally exposed in front of both of them, there was no going back. Sarah looked at those papers, and then at Michael, seeing not just the man who had lied to her, but also the scared boy he used to be, trying to save himself in a house full of fear. The difference now was that she had access to information she'd never had before, and that information was the bridge between understanding Ethan, understanding Michael, and understanding just how long this story had been echoing through their family. The next step was inevitable. If Michael truly wanted to repair anything, He'd have to go deeper and tell, without filters, the full truth about his own childhood. Because only by understanding the truth about Michael's childhood could that family have even a small chance of getting out of the basement. Not just the physical one, but the emotional one they'd all been living in for years. That open box in the basement wasn't just full of papers. It was full of a life Michael had always tried to pretend didn't exist. To understand why he built such a big secret inside his own home, you have to go way back, long before Sarah, long before Ethan, long before the idea of a perfect family. Michael grew up in a place where fear was more constant than sunlight. His father had that kind of presence that changes the weather in a room just by walking in. You know that heavy silence that falls when someone unpredictable enters? That was the soundtrack of his childhood. His mother, worn down and trapped, lived in survival mode, trying to protect him without provoking the man she was afraid of. In that house, emotions were dangerous. Love came with sharp edges. And hey, before we go deeper, if this story is resonating with you, hit subscribe and like the video, because a lot of people grew up like this and never got the words for it inside their own family. As a kid, Michael thought every home was like that. He thought it was normal to walk on eggshells, to measure every word, to read the room by the sound of keys in the front door. Kids don't get manuals, they just adapt. He quickly learned that crying annoyed people, asking questions irritated people, and disagreeing could trigger yelling. So he built himself an armor, became the good son, good grades, quiet, low maintenance. On the outside, that looked like maturity. On the inside, fear was eating through the floorboards. He slept light. He always knew where his dad was in the house, just by the creaks in the floor. That's the kind of upbringing that teaches you one dangerous lesson. If you want to survive in a family, you don't show what you feel, you hide it. In his teenage years, his body got bigger, but the fear didn't get smaller. It just changed shape. He started having those symptoms nobody in that house knew how to handle: tight chest, racing thoughts, the constant feeling that something terrible was about to happen, even when everything was quiet. Panic would show up out of nowhere, in the middle of class, on the way to school, sitting on the couch. When he tried to talk to his father, he got, "Stop being dramatic. Be a man." When he tried his mother, she'd whisper, "Don't start this in front of him. You'll just make it worse." So the message was clear. Whatever was happening inside him was a problem, a nuisance. Only when the school stepped in did he finally get to a doctor. That office was the first place where someone looked at him and saw a kid in pain, not an inconvenience. The doctor talked about anxiety, trauma, family history. And somewhere in there came the line that would haunt him for years. "This can run in families. It's something to be aware of if you ever have children." That one sentence helped create the secret that would later poison his own family. Michael left that office with a label for what he felt and a new kind of fear. The fear of passing his pain down like a bad inheritance. Instead of seeing that as a chance to heal, he turned it into a private mission. No one will ever go through this because of me. He swore that, if he ever had kids, he would do whatever it took to protect them from this shadow. But here's the problem. When you try to protect someone from your past without dealing with it honestly, you don't break the cycle. You just make it more complicated. He moved out, studied, worked hard, built a life. On the outside, he looked like a man who had overcome everything. On the inside, he was still that boy who thought the only safe way to love was in silence. When he met Sarah, that old pattern slipped right into the relationship. He was loving, responsible, reliable, but there were doors in his story he never let her open. Whenever conversations got close to his childhood, he would joke, minimize, or just say, "It doesn't matter now." He wasn't trying to trick her. He really believed the past was something you leave behind. What he didn't realize was that the unspoken past doesn't stay behind. It moves into the house with you. So when the idea of having a child came up, the buried fear woke up again, stronger than ever. Instead of saying, "I'm scared our child might go through what I went through," he went back to doing what he'd always done. He handled it alone. Doctor visits, research, quiet monitoring, no real conversation with the woman who was supposed to be his partner in building this family. That's the twisted irony. Michael didn't create the secret because he wanted to hurt anyone. He did it because he'd been trained, his whole life, to believe that the best way to protect the people you love is to hide your worst parts from them. Love equals shielding. Shielding equals silence. Silence becomes fear, and fear becomes control. Ethan was born into a house that was, on the surface, safer than the one Michael grew up in, but emotionally, there were ghosts living in the walls. Ghosts of everything Michael hadn't dared to face. Sarah thought she'd married a solid man with a rough childhood he'd gotten over. What she actually had was a man who had never really looked his own story in the eye, and who was now trying to outrun it while raising a son. And since we're talking about stories that repeat, let me ask, what city are you watching this from? Because there are a lot of Michaels out there. Quiet, functional, terrified men holding too much inside in the name of protecting the family. Now, locked in that basement, Michael was standing right at the edge of the cycle he always swore he'd break. His childhood, his untreated trauma, his secret preparations, all of it had led to this one brutal scene. His son, out of control, turning a key on him. For the first time, he could see that Ethan wasn't some random problem that fell out of the sky. The boy was carrying, in his own way, the weight of a history that had never been told to him. The family that looked so perfect in photos had been built over a foundation full of cracks, most of them coming from Michael's unresolved past. From here on out, the real question wasn't just, what happened to Ethan? It was, what did we pass on to him without ever saying a word? And the only way to answer that honestly would be to look not just at the father, but at the son. To stop asking only, what's wrong with him? And start asking, what is going on inside Ethan's mind? Victim or villain? Outside the basement, while Michael and Sarah were facing their own ghosts, Ethan walked around the house like someone wandering inside his own head. Every room was a thought, every object a memory. To outsiders, it would have been easy to label him, what a cruel kid, who does that to their parents? But a teenager's mind is never that simple. Ethan carried an explosive mix of anger, confusion, sadness, and a deep fear of becoming something he didn't even fully understand. In his head, locking his parents in the basement wasn't just an act of cruelty. On some twisted level, it felt like self-defense, like locking himself away from a family full of secrets that no one had the courage to say out loud. And before we go further, if this story is doing something inside you, hit subscribe and like the video. These are the kinds of family stories most people live, but almost no one tells. For Ethan, that metal box in the basement wasn't just a pile of documents. It was a distorted mirror. He saw his father's name in diagnoses, saw clinical terms, saw the word risk, saw descriptions of emotions he himself had been feeling but couldn't explain. And worse, he saw his own name mixed in there, on reports, evaluations, observations. Imagine what it's like for a teenager to discover there's a whole file about him inside his own house, hidden. To him, that didn't feel like care. It felt like betrayal. In his mind, that secret wasn't just something his parents hadn't told him. It was proof that maybe they didn't trust him, didn't believe he could handle the truth. When trust cracks inside a family, everything starts to be filtered through fear. A simple look becomes judgment. Silence becomes accusation. A half-explained sentence becomes a conspiracy. Stuck in that, Ethan's mind turned into a maze. There's another hard truth here. A teenager's brain is still under construction. They feel everything deeply but don't always have the tools to organize what they feel. Ethan started interpreting everything through the lens of that secret. If his mom asked, "Are you okay?" he heard, "You're acting weird, you're a problem." If his dad stayed quiet, he heard, "He's afraid of me. He knows something I don't." These distortions are common when fear becomes the main lens. In a healthy family, adults help kids separate feeling from fact. But in a house where no one talks about the real issues, the kid is left alone to write the story. And when someone writes a story alone, in the dark, it almost always comes out darker than reality. By the way, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? It's powerful to see from how many different places this same pattern repeats. From the outside, Ethan's act, locking his parents in the basement, looks purely aggressive. From inside his mind, though, it had a twisted logic. He felt watched, analyzed, managed like a case, not loved as a person. He felt like there was already a script written about who he might become. Unstable, dangerous, like his father. And instead of being invited into that conversation, he was excluded from it. When he found the box, he probably thought, so this is what they really think of me. That's brutal. Turning the key wasn't just about trapping them. It was, in his mind, forcing them to feel what he felt. Stuck, confused, scared, powerless. That doesn't make the act okay. It makes it understandable. There's a big difference. He caused real harm, and yet, the question won't go away. Was he a villain, or also a victim? If you look at it coldly, Ethan crossed a serious line. He put his family in danger. He broke trust in a way that leaves scars. That's true, and it matters. At the same time, he had never been given real tools to deal with what he felt. No one sat down with him and said, "Look, Our family has a history. Your dad went through things. You might have some of that too, but you're not alone. We'll do this together." Instead, he got silence on one side and tension on the other. Michael, paralyzed by fear of his story repeating, watched too closely but explained too little. Sarah, in the dark about Michael's past, couldn't fully understand Ethan's present. The result? A boy who learned to distrust even the love he received. Because if there was a secret about who he might be, maybe every hug came with a hidden but. There's responsibility on Ethan's side too. Acknowledging his pain doesn't erase the impact of what he did. Growing up means, sooner or later, facing the fact that our actions have consequences, no matter how hurt we were when we acted. But here's the key. Responsibility without understanding becomes self-hatred. Understanding without responsibility becomes excuse. What Ethan needed, and what was slowly beginning to form down in that basement, was a space where both could exist. A place where he could say, "I was drowning when I did this," and here we know, while also hearing, "and we can't let it happen again." That isn't about punishing or absolving, it's about healing in a grown-up way. And that's exactly why the next step in this story matters so much. Because while Michael and Sarah were facing their own truths below, there was a specific night, a single turning point, when everything in Ethan's mind really started to fall apart. Nothing he did came out of nowhere. There's always a night where things begin to unravel. And that's exactly where this story is heading next. That night was supposed to be just another ordinary night in a normal family. Simple dinner, TV on in the background, each person half distracted with their own thoughts. Michael pretending to be relaxed after a long day, Sarah tidying up the kitchen, Ethan in his room with the door half closed. No shouting, no slammed doors, nothing that anyone would point at and say, "That's where it all began." And that's the scary part. Sometimes the beginning of the end doesn't arrive with an explosion. It slips in quietly, disguised as routine. That night started like any other, but it would become the moment when the illusion of balance finally cracked. And if this story is still holding your attention, hit subscribe and like the video, because from here on, secret, fear, and family collide in a way that a lot of people will recognize, even if they never say it out loud. Ethan was in his room, pretending to study, but his mind was miles away from the books. Ever since he'd gone through that metal box in the basement, the feeling of living inside a lie wouldn't leave him alone. He kept remembering the way his dad watched him when he was younger, the conversations that stopped when he walked into a room, the whispers between Michael and doctors, always away from Mom. With the papers still fresh in his mind, everything started to make sense in the worst way. It wasn't just that he felt different. He now believed he'd been treated like a risk, like a problem waiting to happen. The fear inside him wasn't just about going crazy. It was about being trapped in a script written before he was even old enough to read it. So when Sarah knocked on the door that night and asked, "You okay in there?" he said, "Yeah." But what he really wanted to say was, "I know the secret, and you still want to pretend I don't." Meanwhile, in the living room, Michael and Sarah were having one of those low-voiced conversations parents have when they don't want the kid to hear. Except that, in this house, not wanting him to hear had been the pattern for years. The difference this time was the topic. Instead of talking about bills, chores, or schedules, they were finally talking about what really scared them: Ethan's behavior. Sarah, exhausted, admitted she was genuinely worried. She mentioned the drawings, the sleepless nights, the mood swings, the way he seemed to carry a weight too big for his age. And then she asked the question Michael had been running from for years. "Is there something you're not telling me about your family, Michael? Something that would help explain this?" That question hit him like a punch. His old fear, the one he'd spent his whole life hiding, surged up again. And instead of seizing that moment to tell the full truth, he froze and did what he'd always done. He answered halfway. He said just enough to not look heartless and just little enough to keep the secret intact. He talked vaguely about nervousness running in the family, said they shouldn't make it bigger than it is, claimed that talking too much about it might make things worse. To him, that sounded like protecting the family. To Ethan, who was listening from the hallway with his ear against the door, it sounded like confirmation of the worst. They knew more than they were saying. When Sarah pressed, asking if there was something serious in his past that might have passed on to their son, Michael shut down, the way scared people do. "Let's not dramatize this," he said. "The boy doesn't need to know everything." For Ethan, standing alone in that dim hallway, that sentence landed like a verdict. The boy doesn't need to know everything. There it was again. Secret elevated to protection. Fear dressed up as, "We're doing what's best for him." After that conversation, Sarah went upstairs with the excuse of grabbing a blanket. She walked past Ethan's door without noticing he'd quietly rushed back to his desk, opened a notebook, and posed as if he were studying. When she poked her head in, he was there, pen in hand, eyes on the page. She asked the usual questions. Need anything? You hungry? Want to talk? He answered on autopilot, like a kid who's learned how to keep adults at a safe distance. Short, neutral replies. On the outside, it was just another mother-son interaction. On the inside, he didn't trust a word of it. He loved her, but he now saw her as part of the machinery of silence. Even if she didn't know everything, she still played along with the version of family that kept him in the dark. She left the room with that vague sense that something was wrong, but still without a clear name for it. Ethan stayed with a different certainty. He was alone in this. Later that night, when the house went quiet, things really started to unravel. Michael and Sarah went to bed thinking they'd had yet another tough but inconclusive talk. Lights went off one by one. In a lot of homes, this would be the moment when everyone finally rests. In this one, it was the moment Ethan stood up. He slipped out of his room, walked down the stairs, each step feeling like a decision. The basement called to him, not as a storage space, but as the heart of the truth. He turned on the weak light, saw the metal box again, and reopened wounds that hadn't even started healing. Rereading certain sentences, re-seeing his name on those pages, he felt his anger mix with despair. What had begun as curiosity had turned into something else, a kind of verdict. He wasn't just Ethan, the son, he was Ethan, the risk. And when fear and humiliation grow side by side in a young mind, extreme ideas start to look like solutions. It was in that mental state, tired, wired, hurt, that the idea came to him. It didn't feel like pure revenge. It felt like a test. If they won't talk, I'll make them feel what it's like to be trapped. Maybe then they'll finally say everything. Locking his parents in the basement wasn't born out of 1 second of impulse. It was the result of a whole night, and really years, of quietly stacked experiences. In his head, it made twisted sense. The basement was where the secret lived. That's where everything started. So that's where everything had to be confronted. Of course, from the outside, we see the danger, the irresponsibility, the very real risk. From the inside, he saw a symbolic act. He didn't want to kill anyone, didn't want to physically torture them. He wanted them to feel what he felt. And what he didn't know yet was that, by turning that key, he wasn't just locking them in. He was locking himself into a point of no return. And it's from that act, from that key turning in the lock, that the next chapter of this story begins. In the dark, with two parents forced to create a plan of escape in the dark, not just from the physical basement, but from the emotional one they'd all been living in for years. When it finally sank in that Ethan really wasn't going to open the door anytime soon, the mood in the basement shifted. The initial panic gave way to a strange, loaded silence, the kind that makes your mind race faster than your heartbeat. Michael and Sarah stared at each other like two survivors after an explosion inside their own family. The question wasn't just, how do we get out of here, but also, how on earth did we end up here? At the same time, something deeper kicked in. Survival mode. Being trapped awakens a primal fear, and that fear doesn't care about emotional nuance at first. It wants a plan. And before we dive into that, if this story is still resonating with you, hit subscribe and like the video, because we're going to keep walking through this mix of secret crying fear and broken family patterns. Michael, even shaken, still had a practical side kicking. His brain started mapping the basement like a blueprint, where the door was, where the shelves stood, what objects could turn into tools, what could be used to make noise or to pry something open. Sarah, on the other hand, felt her heart pounding out of rhythm, but clung to whatever sense of control she could find. She knew that if she let fear take over completely, she'd freeze, and freezing wasn't an option. Michael suggested they start with the obvious: the doorknob, the hinges, any cracks, any weak spots. Every failed attempt tightened the knot in their chests. Still, instead of turning on each other, which would have been the easiest path, they used the guilt they both felt as fuel. We helped push our son to this point, Sarah thought. So now we have to be the adults we weren't before, and find a way out. For us and for our family. As they felt along the walls, they started noticing things they'd ignored for years. The basement had small cracks, a slightly loose wooden panel near the side, and a tiny high window almost hidden behind stacked boxes. Little things that, in the rush of family life, no one had ever really paid attention to. It's a pretty good metaphor. How many possible exits in life get buried under the clutter we keep adding? Old grudges, old fears, conversations never had. Sarah realized she'd always been afraid to mess with things too much. both in the physical basement and in the emotional one. Messing with things raises dust, shows what's broken, exposes what's been stuffed into corners. But now, she didn't have the luxury of that avoidance. She dragged a box with all her strength, nearly tripped, and for the first time saw the little filthy window up top, like a reminder that even in the darkest places, there's usually at least one crack of escape. And since we're talking about this, let me ask you, what city are you watching from? I can easily imagine versions of this scene happening emotionally in a lot of different homes. Michael, spotting the window, started piecing together a more concrete plan. It wouldn't be easy to reach, but it wasn't impossible. Stack boxes, move a shelf, improvise a kind of staircase. And here's something interesting. In crisis, the mind can turn chaos into material. Everything that was just family junk, old toys, decorations, unused suitcases, suddenly became part of the escape. Life is a lot like that. Experiences that once felt like dead weight can become steps, if you decide to move. Sarah, scared but practical, joined in. She held boxes, pushed things, mentally calculated what could collapse and what could hold. And as they did that, something unexpected happened. They started to talk, for real. Not about the weather, not about errands, but about the situation, about Ethan, about what they'd hidden. The physical attempt to escape started to force an emotional shift. At one point, as Michael balanced on a pile of boxes trying to reach the window, he nearly fell. Sarah grabbed his arm on reflex, steadying him. It was a simple gesture, but heavy with meaning. For a second, they didn't look at each other as opponents or as the one who lied more, but as partners trying to save something that might still be salvageable. The fear now had two layers: the obvious one, of not getting out, and the deeper one, of losing their son for good. Michael said, half out of breath, that emotionally they'd been locked up for a long time already, each in their own private basement. Sarah, also panting, admitted she had things she'd never told him, things that might change the way he saw their family. Her words hung there in the air. You ever notice how in a crisis, a lot of people finally say what they've been holding back for years? And if that hits close to home, subscribe and hit like, see, because what's coming next digs even deeper into buried secrets. While they tried to reach the window, they also tried banging on it with whatever they could grab. Not enough to break it fully, but enough to make noise. Maybe a neighbor would hear something, but they knew they couldn't rely on that alone. They also had to count on something happening inside their own house. That included Ethan. Michael started thinking out loud. If we get out of here, or if he comes back, I can't keep running. I'll have to tell everything. Thinking out loud. If we get out of here, or if he comes back, I can't keep running. I'll have to tell everything. About me, about the doctors, the box, the fear I've always had. Sarah listened and whispered, me too. Her phrase and his together were like the draft of a new agreement. But, as in every complicated family story, things are never that simple. Because behind Michael's big secret, there was something else hiding. Sarah's. Choices she had made, knowledge she had kept to herself, all tied to Ethan too. A second layer of secret inside the first. In the end, that escape plan in the dark wasn't just about stacking boxes to reach a high window. It was about starting a different kind of movement. Instead of only reacting out of fear, they began to act despite it. Instead of pretending the problem was only Ethan's extreme act, they started to see him as a mirror reflecting everything they hadn't wanted to deal with. Ironically, the basement, the place where everything unwanted had been stored, became the place where truth finally began to move. But truth always has layers. While Michael thought the focus was only on his past, Sarah was quietly carrying her own weight. She had also made secret decisions, also hidden information, also let fear guide her. All of that was still to come out. The physical escape might work or not, but one thing was certain: new conflicts were being born down there. Because very soon, it would become clear that the father wasn't the only one with a hidden story. There were also secrets inside secrets. Sarah's lie, and when that surfaced, it would completely shift how Michael saw his wife and their family. While Michael was confessing everything he'd hidden about his past, his tests, his fear of passing something on, Sarah listened in a mix of shock and strange relief. In a way, it felt like someone had finally turned on the light in a room she'd always known was there but never dared to open. But as he spoke, another feeling started to rise in her chest: guilt. Because the more he admitted his secrets, the more she felt hers pressing to get out too. It was as if every word he confessed was a mirror being placed in front of her. And before I go deeper, let me say this. If this story is stirring something inside you, subscribe and hit like. A lot of families live on top of these layers of secret, fear, and silence. and almost no one has the courage to talk about it. Sarah had never really seen herself as someone who hides big things. In her mind, the one with a secret was Michael, with his rough childhood, his medical reports, that basement box. She saw herself as the glue of the family, the one who kept the peace, who smoothed out conflicts, who kept things running. But while he talked about doctors, childhood, tests, and anxiety, one particular memory started bothering her like a pebble in her shoe. An old appointment, an exam, a conversation with a doctor she had never mentioned to her husband, a secret she had buried with the same excuse. I'm protecting everyone. And that's the hard part. Often, the people who judge others for hiding things are also holding their own secrets just as tightly. In a family, this gets tangled up in a way that, when the truth starts to come out, nobody is purely victim or purely villain. Years before that night in the basement, back when they were only talking about having kids, Sarah went through a phase of intense doubt. She knew Michael had a complicated story. She knew he avoided talking about his family, about his father, about his past. She knew some of his moods didn't match the calm, funny persona he put on, influenced by a mix of love, anxiety, and comments from friends. She did something on her own. She went to a doctor without telling Michael. She wanted to know about genetic risks, about mental health in the family, about how much the past could affect their future children. She walked out of that appointment with more fear than answers. That doctor mentioned probabilities, factors, family history, stressors. Some things he said were cautious. Others sounded like warnings. And instead of going home and saying, "We need to talk," she did exactly what she'd later criticize Michael for doing. She chose silence. She had a few tests run on herself, asked extra questions, dug into old medical history, and even brought up medications she'd taken in the past, worrying about possible effects. The doctor didn't give her a neat, reassuring speech. He mentioned points to watch, things to monitor, and suggested something crucial, that she and Michael should talk openly about it, as a family, and make decisions together. That was the responsible way. But responsibility rarely feels comfortable in the beginning. So instead of choosing discomfort and honesty, Sarah chose the illusion of peace. She filed away the results in a separate folder, tucked them into a place Michael almost never touched, and made a silent promise. If anything goes wrong, I'll handle it. The same pattern was repeating itself, each adult making big decisions alone, calling it protection, when in truth it was fear calling the shots. The heaviest part of Sarah's lie wasn't just what she'd hidden about herself. It was what happened after Ethan was born. At one of his early pediatric checkups, the doctor made a careful comment that lodged in her mind. He pointed out small things in Ethan's development, nothing dramatic, but enough to say, let's keep an eye on this as he grows. He mentioned family history again, the importance of observing mood, behavior, reactions to stress. He didn't say, your son has a problem. He said, if there's any history of emotional or psychiatric issues in the family, it's good to bring that into the conversation. He even recommended that both parents be involved and informed. And what did she do? She filtered. She went home and gave Michael a watered-down version. Doctor said everything's fine, just to keep an eye like any normal kid. She left out the parts that scared her the most, convincing herself she was shielding him from worry. Down in the basement, years later, listening to Michael confess his own hidden fears and plans, Sarah realized she wasn't just the wife who had been lied to. She was also someone who had chosen not to see what was right in front of her. Ethan had given her signs, times when his sadness seemed too heavy, when his anger didn't fit the situation, when his behavior didn't look like just a phase. And instead of digging deeper, she clung to the fantasy that, if we don't talk about it, it might go away. Now, with the box open and her husband's secret exposed, she felt the other half of the truth pressing against her ribs. It wasn't just Michael who owed explanations. She did too. If she wanted to get out of that basement as something more than a victim of fate, she would have to step into the hard place, admit she had also contributed to the web of fear and secret that suffocated their family. So she did. Sitting on that cold floor, with papers all around them, she looked at Michael and told him what she'd never had the courage to say, that she'd gone to doctors alone, that she'd asked about risks, that she'd heard warnings and chosen not to bring everything home, that at some of Ethan's early checkups, she had heard things that made her heart race, and instead of using that as fuel for joint decisions, she had buried them. She admitted that sometimes, deep down, she suspected that those old fears were materializing in their son, but she clung to denial because it was more comfortable than facing a possible storm. The confession hit Michael hard. He, who had spent the last few minutes seeing himself as the only one who had lied, suddenly realized they'd both been doing the same thing, just in different ways. The sense of betrayal was real, But so was a strange, unwanted relief. The weight of their broken family wasn't on just one pair of shoulders. They were both responsible. A tough question hung between them after that. What would have happened if, years earlier, they had actually talked? If Michael had told the truth about his childhood and his fear, and Sarah had told the truth about the doctor's warnings and her own anxiety, maybe Ethan would have grown up in a different environment, where talking about mental health and emotional pain was normal, not taboo, where he could say, "I'm scared of what I feel," without feeling like a problem, where he wouldn't have had to dig through boxes in a basement to find out who he might be. Instead, he pieced together fragments of truth alone, and the story we make up alone, in silence, almost always hurts more than the real one. But there was still one more layer to this. Besides the box and the papers, there was something else in that basement that Sarah and Michael hadn't fully faced yet. Not a medical report, not a legal document, something more personal, something with Ethan's voice. Because, aside from all their adult secrets, there was also a recording that wasn't meant to be heard, where their son had poured out what was happening inside him before ever turning that key. In the middle of that chaos of scattered papers, reports, and medical files all over the basement floor, there was one small detail that seemed almost invisible, but carried a massive weight. The little flash drive Sarah had noticed before and hadn't had the courage to open. Just a tiny plastic object, easy to lose in any drawer, but in that moment it felt like it was glowing. Michael, hands still shaking, picked it up and stared at it like it was a key, though he had no idea if it would unlock something that could save them or destroy what was left of their family. If this story is still pulling you in, subscribe to the channel and hit like I. Because what's inside this recording is a deep dive into what secret and fear can do inside a child's heart when nobody explains what's going on. They looked around until they found an old laptop in a corner, the kind that takes forever to turn on, like it's coughing itself awake. When the screen finally lit up, the pale blue glow made their faces look even more tired, more worn. Michael plugged in the flash drive carefully. Like any wrong move might erase everything. A folder popped up. Inside, a few text files, a draft with no name, and a single audio file dated just a few weeks earlier, labeled simply, "For myself." That title alone hurt more than any report. For myself. It was like Ethan already knew nobody was ready to hear him. Sarah swallowed hard, glanced at Michael, and for the first time in a long time, they made a joint decision without arguing. They were going to listen. And let me ask you, before we hit play here, what city are you watching this from? Somewhere in your world, there might be a "for myself" like this, hidden in someone's phone or computer, waiting to be heard. When Michael pressed play, the basement went even quieter. The first thing they heard wasn't words, but Ethan's breathing, uneven, like he was nervous just talking to his own future self. Then his voice came through, stripped of all the sarcastic tone, all the teenage armor. It was tired. He started with something simple but devastating. "I don't know if anyone will ever hear this, or if it's just for me to prove I actually existed inside this house." From there, every sentence hit like a punch. He talked about what it felt like to be watched as a project instead of a person. He described how, since he was little, he felt something was off, but never knew if the problem was him or the silence around him. He said that every time he caught Michael looking at him with that mix of worry and guilt, his own fear grew. And that after finding the box, he was sure of one thing. His family saw him as a ticking bomb. Throughout the recording, Ethan wavered between anger and vulnerability. In some parts, his voice rose, sharp, angry. How can someone say they love you and still hide a whole file about who you are? In others, it almost dropped to a whisper. If they knew, why didn't they just tell me? Are they ashamed of me? Or scared of what I might become? He talked about his fear of snapping one day in the middle of school or on the street, of hurting someone without wanting to. He admitted he'd look in the mirror trying to see if his face looked crazy, like the words in the reports. He mentioned that the word secret seemed to live in every corner of the house, in cut-off conversations, in questions that never got full answers, in the tension in the room when his name and the word doctor ended up in the same sentence. It was a boy trying to decode an emotional code no one had ever explained to him. And if this is hitting you, subscribe and hit like. This is what happens when a family lets silence do all the talking. At one point, the audio got even more raw. Ethan started talking about the idea of locking them in the basement, before he ever did it. It was like he was rehearsing his own crime out loud, trying to decide if it was madness or a desperate attempt to be seen. "Sometimes I want them to feel what it's like to be trapped," he said. "To lock them down here and see how long it takes before they finally tell the truth. Not to hurt them, but to see if they can imagine what they did to me." When Sarah heard that, she covered her mouth with her hand. What had seemed like a cruel, random act was, in his mind, a symbolic reversal. You locked me out of my own story. Now I'm locking you in the place you hid it. Symbolic or not, the reality was brutal. Symbols can hurt just as much as actions. As the recording went on, Ethan started talking about himself with a kind of harsh honesty that no one had ever heard from him. He said he loved his parents, but felt betrayed by them. He said he could sort of understand that they had gone through their own pain, but that didn't erase the damage of leaving him alone in his. He wondered if, to be part of that family, he had to accept being half secret and half fear. In one of the most painful moments, he said, "I don't know if I'm the villain in their story or the victim in the story they started before I was born. I just know I'm tired of being the chapter nobody wants to read out loud." Down in the basement, listening to that, Michael and Sarah had no way to hide anymore. For the first time, they weren't dealing with Ethan's behavior, but with his heart, unfiltered, recorded in a file he never thought they'd hear. When the audio finally ended, the basement silence changed again. It wasn't the silence of panic or the silence of secret. It was the silence of impact. No footsteps above, no sound of keys, just the echo of Ethan's voice hanging in the air, mixing with their shallow breaths. That recording that wasn't meant to be heard became, in practice, the only moment where the parents really heard their son. No slammed doors, no sarcasm, no yelling, just truth. Ugly, clumsy, but truth. And as painful as it was, it also made something clear. This wasn't just about genetics, or about Michael's childhood, or about Sarah's omissions. This was about the way they had both chosen silence when they should have chosen dialogue. They were face to face now with the consequences. That flash drive didn't answer every question, but it did erase one illusion, the idea that Ethan had turned the key out of nowhere. The recording showed why he was drowning inside, how long he'd been carrying that load, how hard he'd tried to make sense of things alone. For Michael and Sarah, the next step was no longer optional. They had to stop blaming only the past, only the diagnosis, only the circumstances, and start looking at their own choices. How many times had they ignored a chance to talk? How often had they let fear dictate, "Let's just not bring this up"? Facing that level of truth forces a person to confront something most people run from: guilt. The next chapter in this story isn't about escape anymore. It's about looking those internal ghosts in the eye. And that's exactly where this is headed next. Standing still in that basement, shaken by what they'd just heard, they were about to start confronting the ghosts of their guilt, each one shaped by a mix of love, fear, and all the wrong choices made in silence. When Ethan's recording ended, the silence in the basement changed color. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of guilt. Michael and Sarah stayed where they were, frozen, like time had stopped around them. Every word their son had spoken seemed to echo off the walls. "I just wanted to be seen for real by this family. And if this is hitting something inside you, subscribe to the channel and hit like, because what we're talking about here isn't just their story. It's about how guilt roams through a lot of homes where secret and fear have been sitting at the table for years. Down there was nowhere left to point but inward. Michael stared at the floor, but what he saw inside was a movie. The boy he used to be, the man he tried to become, the father he thought he was, and the one he actually was. He began to see how fear had driven almost every decision he made. Fear of repeating his childhood, fear of shattering the image of the solid dad, fear of showing vulnerability to his own wife. He had turned his terror into control. It's a pattern you see a lot. The most afraid person in a family often looks like the most rigid one. On the outside, control. On the inside, panic. Sarah, for her part, felt the weight of every appointment she'd hidden, every intuition she'd dismissed, every time she chose peace on the surface over facing the storm underneath. It was becoming painfully clear. Both of them had chosen silence at different moments. And silence, when it's repeated long enough, turns into a ghost that never leaves. This was the point where a lot of people in their place would try to run, not physically, but mentally. They might throw out excuses like, "I did the best I could. Nobody taught me how. My childhood was worse." And all of that could even be true. But there comes a point where excuses stop being explanations and become shields. Michael could have spent the rest of his life hiding behind the trauma of his own upbringing. Sarah could have hidden behind her role as the one who held everything together. But there, with Ethan's voice still ringing in their heads, they were forced to step beyond that, to take responsibility, not to flog themselves forever, but to change something. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to carry guilt than to have a hard conversation in your own family? Guilt hurts, but it doesn't require action. Responsibility does. Guilt, if you don't work with it, becomes a kind of prison. You stay stuck in the same script. I messed everything up. I'm terrible. It's all my fault. That might feel honest at first, but in the end, it just keeps everything frozen. Responsibility, on the other hand, asks, okay, I see what I did. Now what do I do with that? Down there, Michael started making that shift without even realizing. He turned to Sarah, and instead of just repeating, I'm sorry, he began to say things like, I should have told you from the beginning. I should have told Ethan. I should have gone to therapy instead of stuffing my fear inside this family as an unspoken rule. Those aren't empty apologies. They're specific acknowledgments. Sarah, in turn, started admitting the times she'd seen signs in Ethan and chosen to look away. She confessed that she had hidden behind phrases like, he's just tired, it's just a phase, because it was easier than admitting something bigger might be going on. But confronting guilt is never neat. It's messy, full of false starts and long pauses. At one point, Sarah almost broke. With tears in her eyes, she admitted, I've always been terrified of not being a good enough mother. And because of that fear, I became exactly the kind of mother who didn't really listen when you were silently screaming. That's one of the hardest things for any parent to say. To realize that the exact fear they ran from pushed them into the behavior they dreaded most. Michael, hearing that, froze. He remembered his own father calling him weak, dramatic, too much. He realized that in different words and gestures, he'd done some of the same to Ethan, not out loud, but in the way he watched him instead of talking to him. He kept thinking, I'm protecting my family, when, in reality, he was reinforcing the pattern that had hurt him. That's when it hit him. His greatest legacy so far hadn't been genetics. It had been emotional avoidance. They also needed to face a hard, uncomfortable fact. It would have been easy to put all the blame on Ethan. He's the one who locked us up. He's the one who crossed the line. And that is true. The act was serious, dangerous, traumatizing, that cannot be erased. But if they stopped there, they'd be doing what most families do when they have a problem child. They'd use him as a lightning rod to avoid facing the storm inside them. In that basement, they started to see him not just as the boy who did something unforgivable, but as the boy who acted out everything this family had hidden for years. Taking that in doesn't cancel his responsibility. It adds context. And maybe this is a good time to ask you, in your own story, is there someone being treated like the problem, when, deep down, they're just the one reflecting what nobody else wants to address? By the end of that stretch of silence and confession, there was no magical resolution, no big embrace, no perfect line of closure. What there was, however, was something new: honesty. For the first time, they weren't hiding behind roles: husband, wife, father, mother. They were just two flawed human beings seeing the wreckage of their shared choices. That's where any real healing in a family begins. Not when everything is forgiven, but when everything is finally named. From that point on, anything they'd try, therapy, conversations with Ethan, rebuilding trust, would have to be built on this raw honesty. The question they now faced wasn't simply, will our son forgive us? But, are we willing to change enough so that forgiveness can even be possible? Still, there was someone missing from this whole scene: Ethan. You can't rebuild a family by only talking among the adults. The boy who'd turned the key was still upstairs, alone with his own guilt, thinking he might be nothing more than the villain in their story. Down in the basement, Michael and Sarah had started their internal battle with guilt. Up there, Ethan was in his own. Very soon, he would have to decide what that act meant, to him and to them. Was it pure punishment? Or was it, in a distorted way, a cry for help? That's what would define their next steps. And that's exactly where this story goes next. Ethan's choice: punishment or cry for help. Upstairs, leaning against the hallway wall, Ethan looked calm in a way that didn't match what he'd just done. But inside, he was anything but calm. The choice he'd made, turning that key, echoed in his chest like a question he still didn't know how to answer. What did I just do? Was this monstrous? Or the only way I knew to protect myself from my own family? He walked around the house like someone pacing inside his own mind. Living room, kitchen, hallway. Every photo on the wall felt like a lie. Birthdays, Christmas, vacations, everyone smiling. That perfect family image didn't match the weight of fear and secret he carried now. At the same time, another question stung. Did I just become exactly what they were afraid I'd be? For Ethan, locking his parents in the basement didn't come from a simple desire to hurt. In his head, there was a twisted logic to it. He'd spent years feeling watched, evaluated, monitored like a case, not included like a person. He'd read reports about himself, found his own name in documents he wasn't supposed to see. He'd discovered that his life had been discussed in offices and basements before being discussed with him. Turning the key felt less like an attack and more like a warped form of justice. You locked me out of the truth. Now I'll lock you in with it. He didn't think about the practical consequences. Injuries, health risks, emergencies. He was focused on emotional impact. But as time passed and the silence downstairs stayed heavy, doubt started creeping in. Is this justice or cruelty? The words he'd recorded on that "for myself" file replayed in his mind like an echo. In that recording, he hadn't just vented anger. He'd confessed loneliness, confusion, and fear. There was nothing theatrical about it. He'd admitted he didn't know if he was the villain of the story or the victim of something that began before he was born. Recalling that, Ethan realized something uncomfortable. Everything he'd said there sounded less like revenge and more like a cry for help. What he wanted, deep down, wasn't to see his parents suffer. It was to finally be heard, to be part of the conversation about his own life, to hear the truth about his family directly from them, not from cold, technical words crammed into a metal box. And that's where the line between punishment and cry for help got blurry. As he paced, he found himself stopping in front of the basement door over and over again. Each time, he'd stand there, listening for any sound. He imagined 100 different reactions. His parents screaming his name, begging, threatening, cursing him. But what rose from below wasn't chaos. It was something else. Voices talking, sometimes breaking, sometimes quiet. He couldn't make out every word, but the tone was different from anything he'd heard from them before. Less defensive, less polished, more raw. That confused him. Part of him wanted to hold on tightly to the idea that they were the bad guys, and he was just the damaged kid reacting. Another part of him, one he didn't trust yet, wondered if there was finally something real happening down there. Ethan's biggest fear at that point wasn't the police, or punishment, or consequences. It was this. What if I open this door, start listening, and get disappointed all over again? Staying in the role of punisher was easier in one sense. If he kept them locked up, he could keep nursing the certainty that he'd been wronged and nothing more. Opening the door meant risking hearing apologies, explanations, and truths that would force him to see them not as monsters, but as flawed people. And that's harder, because once you see someone's humanity, holding on to pure hatred becomes nearly impossible. His choice, then, wasn't just about the lock. It was about deciding which version of himself he wanted to be from that moment on. Downstairs, without knowing exactly what was going on in his head, Michael and Sarah were doing something Ethan never thought they'd do. They were owning their failures. They weren't playing the victim. They weren't saying, "You ruined the family." They were saying, "We hid things. We made decisions alone. We let fear lead the way. We left you alone with questions you had every right to ask." Even through the floor, some of that began to reach him. Not always in clear sentences, but in tone. That tone of people who have finally stopped pretending. And whether Ethan wanted it or not, that started to shift something inside him. Because a harsh truth is easier to carry than the secret he'd been forced to carry alone. In the end, the real decision in Ethan's hands wasn't just, do I let them out or not? It was, from here on, am I going to live as only the boy who locked his parents in a basement, or as someone who, even after doing something terrible, chose to face the mess instead of running from it? Punishment, in its purest form, would have meant keeping the door locked, staying in the role of judge, and walking away emotionally, or even physically, from his family. A cry for help, even a late and messy one, would mean something else. Opening that door, not to forget what happened, but to finally talk about it all. No guarantees, no easy forgiveness, no fairy tale ending, just a risky, fragile beginning. And that's exactly where this story is headed next. Because while the basement had become a place of confession, something else was quietly happening. That dark, dusty space was turning into something it had never been before, a kind of confessional. And the next chapter is precisely about that moment when the basement turns into a confessional and starts to change the story of this family from the inside out. What started as a place of punishment, dust, boxes, a locked door, slowly turned into something no one had planned, a confessional. After Ethan's recording, after the papers, after every secret torn out of old hiding spots, the basement stopped being just a symbol of what their son had done. It became the stage where Michael and Sarah were finally stripping away the roles they'd been clinging to for years. They weren't the parents of the problematic teenager anymore. They were two people, full of mistakes, sitting on a cold floor, trying to face the truth of what fear and silence had done to their family. And hey, if you're still with me here, hit subscribe and like the video, because these are exactly the kinds of stories most families live, but never dare to say out loud. Sitting against that damp wall, they started talking in a way they'd never talked before. It wasn't who's right anymore. It was, where did I hurt you? Michael, voice shaking, began sharing details from his childhood that he'd never even allowed himself to remember clearly, much less say out loud. He talked about nights sleeping fully dressed because he never knew when his father might come storming into his room, about being called weak whenever he tried to ask for help, about the shame of being taken to doctors like a problem to be fixed instead of a son to be understood. Sarah listened with tears in her eyes and realized something. She had always seen her husband as the strong one, but his strength had been built on top of unprocessed pain. For the first time, she saw how that old fear had shaped his impulse to hide things from their family. Then it was her turn. Sarah started confessing the things she'd never said, not because she was evil, but because she was terrified. She talked about the crushing pressure of trying to be a good mother, about how she felt she had to keep the house calm, the image tidy, the family looking stable from the outside. She admitted that, because of that fear of messing up, she ignored instincts. She saw Ethan's heavy eyes, his different drawings, his restless nights, and chose to label it just a phase because the alternative scared her. She admitted she'd gone to doctors on her own, asked about risks, heard warnings, and still decided not to sit down with Michael and build a plan together. I thought I was keeping the peace, she said, but I was really just postponing a storm. Have you ever done that? Chosen quiet on the outside and chaos on the inside, just to avoid one hard conversation. The more they spoke, the smaller the fear seemed, not because it disappeared, but because it finally had a name, a history, a shape. Michael admitted how guilty he felt about stuffing the basement with documents instead of filling the living room with honest conversations. Sarah admitted how guilty she felt about seeing Ethan's suffering and mentally turning down the volume so she wouldn't have to act. Together, they realized that the heaviest thing in that house wasn't the metal box. It was the silence. Silence at the dinner table when something serious came up. Silence in the hallway when Ethan asked, "Why am I like this?" Silence in the bedroom when one wanted to speak but the other was too tired or too scared to listen. And if this is making you think about your own house, subscribe and turn on notifications, because that's the whole point here, to help you see the silence you might be living in. At one point, almost without realizing it, they began speaking directly to Ethan even though he wasn't in the room. Michael said out loud everything he'd always wanted to tell his son but never could, that he loved him not as a project to fix his own past, not as a second chance at childhood, but as a person. That his constant watching wasn't because he thought Ethan was broken, but because he was terrified of missing the signs no one had caught in him. Sarah, crying, said she was sorry for every time she'd minimized his pain, for every "you're exaggerating," for every "it's nothing" she'd thrown over feelings that were, in fact, huge. It was as if the basement walls were hearing, for the first time, the truth that should have been spoken in bedrooms, kitchens, car rides home from school. They weren't rehearsing speeches. They were learning to speak honestly for the first time in their lives as a family. What turned that basement into a confessional wasn't just the confessions themselves, but the posture. They weren't defending themselves. They weren't keeping score. They weren't saying, "Yeah, but you also." They were stripping away the armor. For a few minutes, there was no, "I'm the father, I'm the mother, I'm the responsible one, I'm the victim." There were just two human beings, deeply flawed and deeply scared, realizing that love without truth becomes a prison. They started outlining, between sobs and half-finished phrases, what they would need to do differently if they got another chance. Real therapy, together. Open conversations about mental health. No more decisions about Ethan without Ethan. No more secrets justified as protection. And all the while, life went on upstairs. The same walls, the same furniture, the same photos of their perfect family. But something had shifted even before the lock turned. The basement, which had always been the place for what no one wanted to deal with, had now become the place where everything finally started to be faced. Still, one crucial piece was missing. Their son. Confession between two adults was necessary, but not enough. Ethan was still up there, suspended between villain and victim, holding not only the key to the basement door, but also the key to what would happen to this family after that night. It's right at this fragile point that the next moment becomes vital, because while they were exposing their ghosts below, upstairs the story was moving too. The sound of footsteps above them took on a different meaning. It was no longer just someone walking around the house. It was a sign that the next chapter was coming, where what was said in the confessional basement would have to meet the reality of the boy who'd turned the key. And that's exactly where we're heading. To the moment when the sound of footsteps upstairs becomes the bridge between truth and consequence, between confession and decision. Down in the basement, after all the confessions, it was like the world suddenly remembered there was an outside. The first sign was small, a faint creak in the wooden floor, right above Sarah's head. She froze. Michael did too. They traded a quick look that said everything without words. He's still here. The sound of footsteps upstairs suddenly meant something entirely different. It wasn't just a kid pacing around the house. It was Ethan, carrying a storm of fear, standing on top of the same house that had buried so many secrets. And before we dig further into this turning point, if this story is still speaking to you, subscribe to the channel and hit like. This is exactly where family, fear, and truth start colliding in real time. The footsteps weren't steady. They were uneven, like someone walking without knowing where they wanted to go. Into a room, out again, down the hallway, back toward the stairs. You can tell a lot from the way someone walks in a quiet house. These weren't the firm steps of someone sure of themselves, nor the carefree rhythm of someone relaxed. They sound like thinking on feet. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and pictured him up there. Maybe standing in front of the living room photos. Maybe staring at the basement door. Maybe holding 100 questions in his chest with no idea how to let them out. Michael felt something new, too. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of his son. He was afraid for him. Afraid of Ethan being alone with so much pain, so much guilt, so much confusion. The footsteps upstairs became like a metronome counting down the time they had to finally be the adults Ethan needed. Every small sound took on meaning. A door opening in the kitchen. Was he getting food or digging through more memories? A chair doing that soft scrape on the floor? Was he sitting down or just shifting restlessly? The bathroom faucet turning on and off, washing his face, crying, trying to pull himself together. When a family has lived with unspoken things for a long time, any noise becomes a message. Michael and Sarah started realizing just how many times they'd heard similar signs before. Late-night pacing, heavier footsteps, the sound of someone wandering, and dismissed them as teenage stuff, restlessness, just stress. Now, trapped and forced to listen, they couldn't look away anymore. And let me ask you, what city are you watching from? Because I know for a fact a lot of people out there have learned to read the mood at home by the way someone walks down the hall. Then came the most tense moment. The footsteps stopped right on top of the basement door. Silence followed. Not the empty kind, the thick, loaded kind. Sarah held her breath, as if exhaling too loudly might scare Ethan away from whatever he was about to decide. Michael leaned forward a bit and whispered, "He's listening." That patch of floor had suddenly become an invisible battlefield. On one side, two parents finally owning their part in the story. On the other, a boy deciding whether he'd let himself believe them or not. Michael realized something crucial then. They couldn't wait to get out to start the real conversation. If Ethan was right there, then that was the moment to turn the basement from a secret chamber into a bridge. With his heart pounding, Michael did something he'd avoided Ethan's whole life. He spoke without armor. He raised his voice just enough to reach the top of the stairs, but not in a shout. "Ethan, we heard the audio. We heard everything you said." Sarah watched him, startled, but this time didn't shush him. He went on. "You're right about a lot of things. We messed up. We hid things. We left you alone with a secret that never should have been yours to carry. But we want to fix this. Not as a perfect family, we know we're not, but as real people who love you." Upstairs? Nothing. No words back. Just a silence that made the woods seem to hold its breath. For parents, that kind of silence is one of the scariest things in the world. What if he doesn't care? What if it's too late? What if nothing we say matters anymore? If this part is tugging at you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is where most real-life families choke. They stop right here, out of fear of not being heard. After that first call, the footsteps resumed, but different now. Not the same restless wandering, but a hesitant circling around the staircase. Steps that came closer to the door and retreated, like he was testing how far he could let himself go. That alone already meant something huge. He was listening. Sometimes, in a house full of pain, listening is the first miracle. Michael and Sarah understood that whatever they said from this point on wasn't just filling the air. It was climbing up the stairs and landing directly on their son's heart, even if he didn't respond. Sarah decided she couldn't stay silent anymore either. She moved a bit closer to the bottom of the stairs and spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "Ethan, I'm not going to pretend I didn't fail you. I saw things and ignored them. I was scared. Scared of what it meant. Scared of being a bad mom. I thought staying quiet would keep us safe. I was wrong. You are not a problem that needs to be hidden. You are our son, and we want to stay here with you, even if it hurts to face all this." The footsteps upstairs stopped again. This time, the silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like processing. Ethan was absorbing words he'd waited years to hear, even if he didn't trust them yet. Downstairs, they both resisted the urge to keep talking nonstop just to fill the void. They'd finally learned one of the hardest lessons of any family conversation. Sometimes you have to let your words land and sit, even when it's uncomfortable. You can't bully someone into healing quicker just because you're desperate to feel better. The risk of that moment was huge. Michael and Sarah knew it. Ethan knew it. One wrong tone, one careless phrase, and the fragile bridge might collapse. The basement, which had just turned into a confessional, was now becoming something else. A place where their words either would or wouldn't reach the person who mattered most. They'd taken the first step, speaking honestly. The next step, though, would be even more dangerous. Trying to actually talk with Ethan, not just at him. A real conversation, the kind they'd avoided his whole life, the kind that could either start the repair or break everything for good. And that's exactly what comes next. The risky attempt to talk to their son, through a door that was still closed, to a heart that still wasn't sure if it was safe to open. At that point, everything Michael and Sarah feared most and wanted most was the same thing: contact. It wasn't enough anymore to just hear Ethan's footsteps upstairs and guess what was going on inside his head. The attempt to talk to him, from that basement, was almost an act of faith. They knew they were fragile, full of guilt, full of unfinished truths, but they also knew that staying quiet now would be repeating the same mistake that had dragged their family to this point. Michael moved closer to the bottom of the stairs, as if climbing a few steps could also bring his voice closer to his son's heart. He took a breath that shook slightly and decided to speak, not as the strong father, not as the one in control, but as a man who had finally dropped the act. "Ethan," he began, "I know you're up there. I know you're probably wondering if we're going to pretend nothing happened." His voice cracked a bit, but he pushed through. "I'm not going to pretend. We heard your recording. We read the papers. We saw the size of what you've been carrying alone." He didn't use the old tone of lecture or authority. He spoke like someone who knew he'd failed. "You're right about a lot of things," he continued. "I let my fear run our family. I hid my past. I hid things about you. I thought I was protecting everyone, but I was really just protecting myself. From shame, from pain, from being seen the way I see myself." That, for Michael, was a huge shift. Instead of putting Ethan in the role of problem, he put himself in the picture as part of the cause. Sarah realized she couldn't stay quiet and leave everything on Michael's shoulders. She climbed 2 steps, just enough to feel closer to the door, and spoke with the kind of voice mothers usually reserve for when something truly matters. "Ethan," she said, "you have every reason to be angry with us. I need you to hear me say that. I saw things in you and minimized them. I told myself it was just stress, just a phase, because I was scared of what it might really mean." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I went to doctors without telling your dad. I heard things I didn't want to hear. And instead of facing that with you, with him, as a family, I tried to keep everything normal on the surface." She didn't backpedal. She didn't say, "But we love you," as if that erased anything. She was doing something much rarer, apologizing without adding a "but." Upstairs, Ethan didn't answer. No yelling, no insults, no tears they could hear. Just the sound of someone shifting their weight on the floor. For parents, that kind of silence is torture. The temptation to fill it with words is huge, to promise, to justify, to beg. But some part of Michael understood that they'd been talking around Ethan for years, and that this time, they had to talk to him, then give him space. So instead of dumping everything at once, he tried to be precise. "What you did was serious, son," he said quietly. "Locking us in here is dangerous. It scared us. It can't happen again. But I understand more now why you got to this point. And I don't want the boy who locked his parents in the basement to be the only version of you that exists in this house." Responsibility and compassion, together, that was new ground for this family. They also knew that when, they got out of there, it wouldn't be enough to sweep it all under the rug and say, "Let's move on." So Michael laid out something concrete. "If we get out of here, we're going to need help. All of us. Not just you. We'll go to therapy with you, not to fix you, but to learn how to live with the truth together. No more boxes, no more reports hidden in basements, no more decisions about you without you." Sarah added, "We can't promise this will be easy, or that we won't mess up again, but we can promise one thing. The time of secrets in this family is over. If you open this door, we start doing this as 3 people, not 2 adults making decisions for a scared kid." Upstairs, leaning against the wall near the basement door, Ethan listened with his heart pounding. Every word they spoke pulled on a different part of him. One part wanted to scream that it was too late, that nothing they said could erase the years of silence. Another part, softer and more fragile, wanted desperately to believe that maybe, just maybe, they really meant it this time, that they weren't just trying to calm things down, but to change. His biggest fear in that moment wasn't that they were lying, it was that they were telling the truth, and that believing them might hurt even more. Because if he opened himself up and things went back to the old pattern, the damage would be worse than ever. Down in the basement, they couldn't see his face. They didn't know if he was crying, angry, or numb. All they had was the sound of his presence and the knowledge that, for the first time, they were putting everything on the table. Guilt, love, mistakes, secrets, the whole mess. It was a risky attempt. There were no guarantees of forgiveness. No guarantee he would talk. No guarantee they'd ever be the same. But one thing had finally changed. They were choosing truth over the comfort of pretending. What came next would depend on Ethan, on whether he'd see their words as just another performance or as the start of something new. And that decision was tied to one last piece of Michael's story, something he still hadn't fully confessed, something that could either solidify their honesty or shatter whatever trust Ethan had left. That's where we're going next. Michael's final revelation, the one that would show whether this family really had hit bottom or still had one more floor to fall through. At the bottom of the stairs, after everything he'd already confessed, Michael still felt a heavy stone lodged right in the center of his chest. It was like he'd told 90% of the truth, but the last 10% was the part that could actually split his family in half. He knew that if he didn't say it now, he'd be repeating the same pattern all over again. Half truth, half healing, half repentance. And that's exactly what had brought them here. Up to this point, fear had always convinced him to hold something back. But now, the fear of losing his son for good was bigger than the fear of being exposed. So he took a breath that didn't come easy and said, "Ethan, there's something I still haven't told you, or your mom, and it might be the worst part." Sarah turned toward him in shock. She thought they'd already reached the bottom. Hearing him say there was more made the floor feel even less stable. Michael kept going, his voice low and raw. "When you were younger, around 7 or 8, I was already terrified you might go through what I went through. I started seeing specialists, talking to doctors, and one of them made me an offer." The footsteps upstairs seemed to freeze. He suggested that if certain signs showed up, we could act fast, monitoring, early medication, even hospitalization if things got bad. And I signed a paper authorizing all of that without telling anyone. The words hung in the air like a dropped weight. Sarah's reaction was immediate. "You did what?" Her voice broke between disbelief and hurt. Michael didn't dodge. He explained that, in his mind, that document was a kind of insurance policy, a way to make sure that if the worst happened, they could act quickly, without delays or bureaucracy. But in practice, it was confirmation of Ethan's biggest fear, that he'd always been viewed as a potential danger, not just as a son. "I gave doctors, schools, the system, more power over you than you ever knew," Michael said. "They sent me reports on your behavior in class, your mood, your reactions. I read everything, put it in that box in the basement, and convinced myself I was just being a careful father. But I went way past that. I let them treat you like a case behind your back." The worst part came next. Michael's voice almost failed him, but he kept going. "There was a day when one of the doctors suggested we consider a preventive hospitalization. He said that if certain behaviors started to appear, it might be safer to remove you from home for a while. I said no, that I would never let them do that." He paused, eyes closed. "But the truth is, the paper I'd already signed gave them room to push for that kind of thing, without you even knowing." Now, the image of that document Ethan had found in the basement made brutal sense. It wasn't just a form. It was the written proof that at some point, the idea of locking him up for his own good had been on the table. And who had put that option there? His own father. The same person now locked in the basement because of him. Sarah began to cry in a different way. Less from sadness and more from that deep, stunned hurt. "You handed them that kind of power over our son without even talking to me," she asked. "You didn't trust me, or him, or our family enough to decide together?" Michael didn't try to soften it. "No. I was scared and I acted alone. I thought I knew best. I thought I was the only one who really understood how bad it could get. And when Ethan found that document, I can only imagine what it did to him. If I'd found something like that about me as a teenager, I would have felt exactly the same, like a monster waiting to happen." Upstairs, Ethan listened to all of it like someone watching the missing pieces of a nightmare finally fall into place. He wasn't wrong. The document he'd found really was what he thought. Written proof that his life was being managed behind his back. But hearing his father admit it in that broken tone, gave the whole thing a new color. It didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't make the signing of that paper any less serious. But it showed something he'd never really considered. That behind the control was a huge, unworked fear, not hatred. That his father hadn't seen him as trash, but as someone he was desperately trying not to ruin. It was a twisted kind of love, the worst kind. Love guided by panic. Down in the basement, Michael finished with the only thing he had left: vulnerability. "Ethan, I don't have the right to ask anything from you," he said, "but I'm going to anyway. Not that you forget, not that you pretend this wasn't horrible. I just want to ask you one thing. Don't let that paper decide who you are. You are not a project. You are not a risk report. You are not a diagnosis waiting to happen. You are my son, our son, and if you ever give us another chance, it's going to have to be with everything out in the open. No more secrets, no more boxes, no more decisions made over your head." He knew he couldn't erase what he'd done. He couldn't erase the fear, the document, the box, or the years of silence. But for the first time, he had stopped hiding. All the cards were on the table now. The next move didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to Ethan. And whatever his son chose to do with that truth, with that last, heavy revelation, would change the shape of that family forever. The only thing left to happen now was the sound they were all unconsciously waiting for. The sound of the key. Because the next part of this story is exactly that moment. Ethan's decision and the sound of the lock, defining whether this night would end in permanent fracture or in the first shaky step toward something different. 19. Ethan's decision and the sound of the key upstairs, still leaning against the wall. Ethan felt like the world had shrunk to the space between him and that basement door. The last thing he'd heard from his father wasn't a justification. It was a confession. Now he knew the full story behind that document that had haunted him. Yes, his father had given others power over his life without telling him. Yes, he'd been treated like a possible risk. But he'd also just heard, in Michael's voice, something he'd never really recognized before. Terror. Not of Ethan, but of failing him. That didn't make the hurt go away, but it made it more complicated. It's easier to hate a pure villain than to deal with a parent who is deeply flawed and deeply afraid at the same time. Ethan's choice in that moment wasn't simple. If he kept the door locked, he could stay in the role he'd carved out. The hurt one, the one with every right to walk away, the one who finally made them feel something. He could cling forever to the certainty that he was nothing but the victim of a hypocritical family. Or worse, he could sink into the opposite certainty, that he was now officially the villain, the dangerous son who locked his parents in the basement and crossed a line you don't come back from. Both scripts were tempting in a twisted way. Victimhood and villainhood both offer a strange, cold comfort. They're simple. You don't have to rethink anything. You just stay what you already decided you are. But something else was happening. Exhaustion. Ethan was tired. Tired of fear. Of pretending he didn't care. Of carrying rage like armor. Of living inside a house where every room seemed to echo with unsaid things. Remembering his own recording, "I don't know if I'm the villain in their story or the victim in the one they started before I was born," he realized something important. He didn't actually want to be either. He didn't want to spend his life as the boy who locked his parents in a basement, nor as the poor kid they ruined. He wanted a third option, even if he didn't know what it looked like yet. And that third option began with a small, concrete gesture, deciding what sound the key was going to make. Downstairs, Michael and Sarah didn't move. They'd said everything. Now they were in the hardest place for any parent, the place of waiting. Waiting to see if their honesty would land. Waiting to see if their son would choose to punish or to risk reconnecting. They heard the soft creak of a floorboard. Then another. Ethan was walking toward the stairs. Each step sounded heavier than the last, like everyone carried a whole year of unspoken tension. He stopped at the top of the stairs. For a second, nobody breathed. Then came the sound that would be burned into all three of their memories forever, the slow turn of a key in a lock. That click wasn't cinematic, it was quiet, but it echoed in their chests like an earthquake. Ethan didn't slam the door open. He turned the key, paused, and only then opened it slowly, leaving a narrow gap at first. Light spilled down the stairs in uneven strips, cutting the darkness into jagged lines. No one jumped into anyone's arms. There were no dramatic speeches. Just three people looking at one another like they were seeing each other for the first time. Ethan, pale, eyes red from crying in silence. Michael and Sarah, still sitting on the floor, looking smaller than he'd ever seen them. The fact that he'd unlocked the door didn't mean he forgave them. It didn't mean he was over it. It meant something else, just as profound. He wasn't ending the story there. That sound of the key wasn't a happy ending. It was a comma, a pause that said, "Okay, I'm not ready to throw you away, but I'm not ready to pretend nothing happened, either." From that moment on, everything would have to be renegotiated. Trust, boundaries, conversations, even the idea of what family meant for them. The basement wouldn't just be the place where something terrible had happened. It would be the place where their old dynamic had died, and something new, messy and uncertain, started to be born. Whether that something would turn into healing, or just a cleaner kind of separation, would depend on what they did after stepping out of that room. And that's the hardest part that most stories skip: what happens after the door opens. Because unlocking the basement doesn't automatically unlock the heart. That's a slower, more painful process. The next chapter is exactly about that. What happens after the basement? The delicate, confusing time when they have to decide whether this will lead to freedom, forgiveness, or a more conscious rupture. Once the door opened and they climbed the stairs, the strangest feeling hit all three of them. Nothing in the house had changed, and yet nothing was the same. The walls were the same, the photos were the same, the mess on the table, the half-dirty glasses in the sink, everything in its place. But the three people walking through that space weren't who they had been a few hours earlier. Michael felt like a guest in his own living room. Sarah leaned on the kitchen counter just to steady herself. Ethan stayed near the entrance, close to the door, like someone who still wasn't sure whether he was staying or leaving. No one went in for a hug. There were no "I love yous" tossed out to fix things. There was just a heavy, honest awareness. Something had broken. And the question now wasn't, how do we go back to normal? But, what do we do with what's broken? The physical freedom, being out of the basement, had come. But the emotional freedom? That was a project that would take time, work, and choices. Forgiveness, for instance, wasn't a button anyone could press. Michael knew he had no right to expect Ethan to just say, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. Signing that paper hadn't been okay. Hiding information hadn't been okay. Letting fear run the house and calling it care hadn't been okay. Sarah knew she couldn't just hide behind, "I meant well." She'd chosen silence, ignored signs, and tried to keep the family calm at the cost of her son's emotional reality. Ethan, on his side, knew, whether he liked it or not, that locking his parents in the basement was a serious act. It didn't matter that he'd been in pain. What he did had consequences. If forgiveness ever came, for anyone, it would have to be built little by little, on top of responsibility, not denial. That's why one of the first adult decisions they made, together, was to ask for help. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a way to tick a box, but as a recognition that they weren't going to handle this alone. Therapy wasn't for fixing Ethan, it was for all three of them. In those first sessions, they didn't show up as parents and child, but as three people trying to understand how secret and fear had taken over their family. Some sessions were rough, with old wounds ripped open again. Others were quiet, with long stretches where no one knew what to say. They talked about their past, their expectations, their unrealistic beliefs, the roles each had taken on. Michael finally told his whole story without cutting pieces out. Sarah finally admitted she'd been more worried about appearing like a good mother than about actually doing the uncomfortable work of being one. Ethan finally had a space where his anger wasn't treated as rebellion, but as a symptom of a deeper pain. And what about rupture? It remained a real possibility. There were days when Ethan thought seriously about leaving, about putting physical distance between himself and that house. Not in a dramatic way, but as a needed boundary. Some time away with relatives, or eventually in his own place, came up as options in therapy. They didn't pretend that staying under the same roof automatically meant staying together in the emotional sense. In some moments, the healthiest path looked like temporary distance, allowing everyone to breathe, think, and rebuild themselves as individuals before trying to rebuild as a group. Rupture doesn't always mean hate. Sometimes it's just honesty about the fact that something can't keep functioning the way it has. Still, little by little, signs of a different kind of freedom began to show up. Freedom to name things that, before, would have been shoved back into the basement. "I'm not okay today. I'm scared this is happening again. I need space. I need help." Michael stopped acting like mentioning mental health would summon disaster. Sarah stopped changing the subject when conversations got intense. Ethan started testing small openings, saying when something bothered him, asking questions, calling out contradictions. There were fights, sure. Doors closed more firmly than they needed to be. Old phrases slipped out sometimes, but there was a difference. Now they knew what they were dealing with. The monster wasn't invisible anymore. It had a name, years of untreated fear, buried secrets, and a family that had tried to survive by running from the truth. In the end, there wasn't one simple label for what happened after the basement. It wasn't pure freedom, pure forgiveness, or pure rupture. It was a mix. They found some freedom the day they stopped pretending. They tasted pieces of forgiveness in moments, small, fragile, but real, when someone managed to say, "I understand at least a little better now." And there was rupture, too, with old patterns, old silences, old roles. The perfect family from the photos died that night, but the chance for a more honest family, messy, scarred, imperfect, but real, was born in its place. What happened between them from there on wasn't a fairy tale. It was work. Some days they'd move 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Some scars would remain. Some things would never be the same. But one truth stayed clear for all 3. What almost destroyed them wasn't Ethan. It wasn't the diagnosis. It wasn't the basement. It was the silence. And what started to save them wasn't a miracle. It was the decision, painful, clumsy, and ongoing, to finally speak. You know what scares me the most, looking back? It's not the moment the basement door slammed. It's thinking about how many times we almost could have avoided all this and didn't do anything. How many nights I noticed that distant look in Ethan's eyes and thought, "I'll ask him calmly later." How many times I saw Michael's tense face and chose not to poke, afraid of uncovering one more secret. The truth is, if our family got to the point where a son locked his parents in the basement, it's because we ignored everything that came before. And maybe now that you know our story, the most important question isn't about us. It's about you. What have you been ignoring in your own home? I'm not here to act like the perfect victim or turn Ethan into a monster or a hero. I'm here to tell you, with the honesty that took me years to find, that love alone does not keep a family standing. Love without conversation turns into weight. Love mixed with fear turns into control. Love full of secret turns into a ticking time bomb. If I could go back in time, I would have asked questions before the screaming, looked for help before the chaos, told the truth before the basement. And that's what I want to challenge you with today. Who in your family do you really need to listen to? Who's been acting different, quieter, more explosive, more distant, and you pretend not to notice because you don't know what to do? Maybe there's a basement in your life too, not made of concrete, but emotional. That topic nobody touches, that memory everyone dodges, that pain everybody feels but nobody names. Let me ask you eye to eye. Do you want to keep pretending everything's fine until somebody explodes? Or are you willing to take the uncomfortable risk of being the first to say, "We need to talk"? Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. A secret never disappears. It just changes hiding spots. Either you deal with it, or it deals with you. I don't know where you are in your own story. Maybe you're a mom or dad, seeing yourself in me, terrified to admit you've messed up with your child. Maybe you're the son or daughter, seeing yourself in Ethan, carrying that mix of anger and longing for your own family. Maybe you're someone who grew up like Michael, with a childhood full of fear, desperately trying not to repeat what you lived through. What I do know is that there is always a choice. Not always easy, not always pretty, but it's there. You can choose to ask for help. You can choose to say what's been stuck in your throat. You can choose to let go of the image of a perfect family so you can finally have a real one. And now I want to really push you a little. What are you going to do today? Not tomorrow, today, to change even 1 millimeter of your story? Are you going to text someone in your family? Are you going to schedule a hard conversation, even with fear sitting right beside you? Are you going to apologize for something you've been pretending is already in the past? Or maybe you'll reach out for professional help, not because you're weak, but because you finally realized you can't handle everything alone. Think about that carefully. If our story is good for anything, let it be this. So you don't wait to reach your own basement before you take action. And before we wrap up, I really want you to interact with me. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? Is there a basement in your life that you feel you need to open? Is there any secret that weighs on you? Any fear that freezes you? Any point in your family that nobody has the courage to touch? Write it out. Let some of it out, even if it's just a few words. Sometimes, the first step to changing a story is simply stopping pretending it isn't happening. If this story helped you reflect, moved you, or poked at something inside you, I'm going to ask you from the heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave your like. That way, you help me keep bringing deep, human stories, full of flaws and chances to start over, just like mine. And who knows, in the next video we might talk even more about how to turn pain into a turning point instead of a life sentence. Because in the end, the real question isn't, is your family